What's going on, guys? In this video, we're going to be going over Lightroom basics and all the individual sliders, what they all mean. So what we're going to be doing is going to import a photo into Lightroom. We're going to use all of the individual sliders and all of the individual filters and go over exactly what they mean and what they affect with a photo. So Adobe have just recently updated their entire suite of programs, and Lightroom is one of them. So there's a few new features updated for 2020. So let's get into it and let's find out what each and every one of those sliders and icons means in Lightroom. Let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to open Lightroom. And in this video, we're going to be doing Lightroom Classic, not Lightroom CC. So Lightroom CC is more of an on-the-go solution for Lightroom. So if you're moving around and you want your library to be backed up in the cloud, then that's what Lightroom CC is. Now, lots of it is going to be very similar, but this one we're going to be focusing on Lightroom Classic. So we're going to want to open Lightroom Classic. We're going to want to go to the top tab, which is the library tab, and we're going to want to import the new photos that we're working with. So we're going to choose import photos and video. And then over here on the left, we have source. So that's going to be where our photos are stored and saved. We're going to navigate to where those photos are stored on our computer. So for me, it's in this folder. And these photos are just from a shoot recently in San Diego that I took. So we're going to have all of those selected and we're going to import all of them. Now those new photos, they're going to get added to our library and they're going to be stored in these tabs under catalog. So you've got all photographs. So that's all photographs that you've ever imported into Lightroom, which are saved into Lightroom. Now, if you save them on a hard drive and that hard drive is not plugged into your computer, they're not going to show up. But as long as you've imported them, they're going to show up as a little stored cached thumbnail. You just won't be able to edit it if the computer can't locate it. But for now, it's selected the previous import, and that's going to be the last import of the photos that we selected. So for here, we just have 22. So here we have the individual photos, and we're under the library tab. So to be able to edit photos, we want to move into the develop module. So we can do that by clicking develop, or we can hit D on our keyboard. So let's hit D, and it's going to open up the photo that we selected in the develop module. And you'll see at the bottom here, here's all of the photos that we just imported from our previous import. If we were in library, all photographs, and here are our last imports. If we open that in the develop module, you'll see now here at the bottom, we've got every photograph that I've ever imported into Lightroom. For now, we'll go back to previous imports. We can just see the last set of photos that I was working with. We'll hit D to open up develop. Now develop is where we're going to be making all of those adjustments. That's where we're going to be editing the colors, changing the values, and making these photos more visible. So we'll start on a photo that we can see just a little bit clearer. Okay, so we're going to go with this photo of the view from San Diego up on one of the mountains. And then what we're going to see here, we've got the basic settings. Now we've got all of these sliders. So let's take a look at what they do. We've got temperature. It's nicely illustrated by the color. Towards the left, it's going to cool it. Towards the right, towards orange, it's going to warm it up. So if we look at this photo and we see we want it to look a little bit more warm, we want to give it the golden hour vibe, we can just slightly move that slider over to the right. Now, tint is going to be the same, but for two different colors. We've got green and purple, so we can tint it more towards the green or we can tint it more towards purple. I wanted them to go for something a little bit more warmer with this photo, so I'm just going to push it up towards the purples. Exposure is the overall brightness of an individual photo. So it's not going to affect individual parts of the photo, it's just going to brighten up the entire photo. So let's have a look. If we slide that up, you can see how it's just going to blow that photo out of proportion. Or if we drag it the other way, it's going to darken it to the point almost of pitch black. So I think in terms of exposure, it's a little bit too bright, but we're not going to adjust the exposure setting. That's the overall brightness and darkness of that photo. If we drag any slider up in Lightroom, we can either drag it back down to 0 if we made a mistake, we can do Command Z to undo, or if we want to change a bunch of things all at once and we can't undo that many times, you can't go back in time that far, we can just double click on the text. So we've got here exposure. So if we just double click on exposure, it's just going to reset it back to 0. So if you've got a bunch of edits and you want to undo all of them, but you don't want to restart completely, just double click on that word and it's just going to reset that for you. So I can see here we want a bit of extra contrast. So contrast is going to brighten the lighter areas and darken the darker areas. So it's going to increase those ranges between light and dark and make them more prominent. Explaining contrast is a little bit easier if we do reverse contrast. You see how flat, if we go to -100, it's kind of flat. There's no bright areas, there's no dark areas, it's this kind of gray wash. Increasing contrast is the opposite, darkening those darker areas and brightening those brighter areas to add contrast. This photo is naturally pretty flat, so we're going to add some contrast. Now highlights. Highlights are the brightest part of an image. So here in this image, we're going to have the highlights are going to be the sky and a little bit of the ocean and the coastline. Now, if we just drag those highlights down, you can see we're getting just a little bit more info in the sky and the sea. On the flip side, if we were to increase those highlights, you see how it blows out the sky and we lose all the kind of detail in there. So for this, we're going to drag it down all the way because it's not doing too much. Next up, shadows. So if highlights are affecting the brightest part of the image, shadows are the darkest parts of the image, and we can lighten those dark parts of the image or we can darken those dark parts of the image. If we drag up shadows, you see how everything that is in the foreground that was naturally a little bit darker, there's more information there. So we're bringing those shadows back up. Now, if we were to crush those shadows, drag it all the way down, we're going to darken those darker areas of the photo. What I want to do is I want to bring back some of the information in the shadow areas. So that's this whole housing greenery area, and we get all this lovely information back. Moving on to whites. Whites is just going to increase or decrease the whites in the photo. So we can drag that up and you see how it's brightening the white parts of the photo, but not the darker parts, the shadowy parts that we just increased. Or we can drag that down to darken. I'm just going to leave the whites exactly where they are because I think the whites look good as they are. Blacks is exactly the same as whites, but for the blacks. So same that we have shadows and highlights, we have whites and black, and they do something very similar. We've got the darkest parts of the image that we can crush all the way down to pure black, or we can increase them to more of a gray, non-pure black. So let's have a look what that does. If we increase them, see how it's very similar to what the shadows were doing, right? It's lifting those darker parts. And if we drag it back down, it's going to crush those shadows and it's going to make it look more contrasty. So I'm just going to pull that down just ever so slightly on this image. So now we have presence under the basics tab. We've got these selections here. We've got texture, clarity, and dehaze. And these will do something very similar, but they do have a slight difference. If we increase the texture, it's going to pull out the textured parts of the image. So it's basically just adding in pixels to give more detail in the photo, similar to sharpening. So for this one, because there's so much detail in the image, there's lots of buildings, lots of trees in the ocean, texture is great. It's adding in the texture. If we pull texture down, all those textured areas, if we just zoom into the image, all these textured areas are a little bit softer. It's kind of like just adding like a whitewash over the entire thing. So let's see that again while we're zoomed in. If we increase the texture, see how it's just adding individual contrast to those micro elements. So we'll just reset that. And just by resetting it, you see how that pulls it back down to a more softer slight of look. Clarity is going to do something very similar to texture, but on a more contrasty basis. So let's zoom out. And if we drag clarity up, you see how it's adding in detail, but on a more contrast basis, right? All those darker areas are darker. So now if we were to drag it down, you see how -100 on clarity is much more of a soft wash than the texture. So I think for this photo, what I'll do is I will add some texture in there and I'll drag the slider of clarity up. Now dehaze is the next one that we have to work with, and that's kind of exactly how it sounds. So if you've got an image that's kind of hazy, a little bit of haze in there, a little bit of the clouds, where you can drag that up or drag that down to affect the haze. So if we were to drag it up, we're going to get a little less of that hazy look, and it's going to work to add contrast into those highlights. If we just focus on the sky up here and we increase that dehaze, you see what it's doing? It's adding in all of that crazy contrast into the highlighted areas. It's affecting the shadow areas as well, but it's mainly going to be affecting the light areas because it's removing or adding in the haze. If we wanted to add haze in, maybe it's too contrasty and we want to add a little bit of that haze in, well, we can drag it down and you see how that's giving it a whitewash, like this crazy overcast hazy type of a day. For this, I don't want any haze. Now we've got vibrance and saturation, two very similar sliders, but they do different things. So if we look at vibrance and we push vibrance all the way up, so what that's doing is it's affecting the individual color channels. So see the ocean is nice and blue and the greens of the trees are really crazy blue. Obviously this is too saturated, which we wouldn't want. So that's 100 on vibrance. Let's see how that compares on 100 on saturation. We push it up, you see how it's not as saturated as when we use the vibrance. So vibrance is just a little bit more, it adds contrast into those individual colors as well as saturation. So what we're going to do is we're going to increase the vibrance and we're going to increase the saturation for this photo a little bit, and then we can move on. down to tone curve. By default, we've got the tonal curve, and what tonal curve allows us to do is mess with those individual sections of a photo in terms of the light. So if we're in this one, this is our master tonal curve, and what is common to do with tonal curves is to create an S. And by adjusting the tonal curve, we can affect the contrast of those individual color channels. We can also break that down by red, blue, and green, and we can affect the contrast of those individual colors. So let's start playing around. So if we have the midtones are in the middle and the highlights are in the highest part and the shadows are in the lowest part, and we want to make the S curve. So whenever you think of tonal curves, we think of S curves because that's what's adding in contrast in the highs and then contrast in the shadows in the bottom part of that S curve. So we'll make a point to lock us in the middle, and we'll make a second point over here, which is where our highlights are. So if we lift that up, you can see how the highlights are getting lighter and lighter and lighter. If we were to bring that down, they're going to get lower and lower, and they're going to get grayer and grayer. So we'll put a little bit in the highlights, and then over here, which is the shadows, if we were to bring that down, you see how what effect this is having on those shadows. If we lift it up, it's increasing the shadows, similar to that slide that we have earlier, but this just gives us a little bit more of a refined control. It's not just add contrast in the shadows or remove contrast in the shadows. We can really fine tune these individual elements. So we're going to crush the shadows by pulling this down. You see how it's just darkening that area. I'm just going to pull this down ever so slightly. Now we've got the blacks are in this far corner and the whitest whites are in the top corner. So say for example, like we could affect the blacks in the blacks slider under basics, we can also affect the blacks here in the tonal curve. If we were to take this point, we can click on it, we can drag it up, and you see how that's moving these shadows to a past grey towards blue, and we can inject all of that extra colour into the darkest parts of the image. Or we can have true black, which is in the far corner of the tonal curve. Now it's exactly the same for the highlights in the top right corner. We can pull those down, and you see how it's just pulling down those highlights, and we're left with this kind of grey looking thing. Now we want to pull those down just ever so slightly, and now we've got the midtones in the middle of the image. So that's nice and easy to remember. So if we look at the midtones and we click to add a point, you just click anywhere on the graph. You can just double click on any point to remove it. So if we want to look at this midtones, you see it's going to affect the mids of the image. So not just the highlights or the shadows, it's the midtones. So that's where it was in the middle. If we think it was too dark, we can shift it to the left and it's going to brighten up those midtones. Or if we think it's too bright, we can shift it down and to the right, and it's going to start to darken those midtones. So let's move it down because overall it's pretty bright, to slightly to the right. Now say for example we get a little bit too confused in the tonal curve, we have too many points, it's kind of all over the place, we don't really know what to do, we don't want to individually double click all of those points. What we can do is we can just right click and we can hit reset channel, and it's just going to give us that straight line down in the tonal curve section again, so you don't have to go in and readjust. Right click, reset it, and you're good to go. Now what we can also do is we can affect the individual color channels in the tonal curve section. So just like before, the right hand side is going to affect the brightest parts of the image, the highlights, and the lower left side is going to affect the darkest parts, the shadowy parts, but of that one individual color channel. So let's start to see what happens. Let's make a point in the middle for our midtones, and if we increase it, we're going to start to introduce red into the image. And if we decrease it, we're going to start to introduce that green into the image. And what's great, and this is one of the newest features that Lightroom has added, is it gives you these shades on either side. So you can see up towards the left is the red, and towards the right in the bottom is that green color. So whichever way we shift, that's going to be adding in that color. Now we can also do the S curve in the individual color channels to give more contrast to those colors and make them really pop out. So that's a really popular editing thing. So if we go here and we increase a point here, and we go down to the bottom here, and we click, make a point, and make a little contrast S curve in the red. We can go over into our green channels, and here we can have green and purple, similar to the tint feature at the top. If we move it up towards the left, we get green, and if we move it down towards the right, we get purple. So we'll do the same again. We'll make an S curve. So we'll make a point in our middle for our midtone, so that's going to lock in that value so it doesn't get moved out of the way. We'll make a little lift over here in the greens, and then a little decrease, adding in a little contrast. Same again for blues. So we've got blues in the uppers and yellow in the lower. Let's see what happens if we start to shift those channels. So we lift it up to the left, we're getting added blue into our image. And if we come down to the right, we're getting added in yellow into our image. So let's lock in a point for our mids. We'll make a point over here for our highlights and increase, and then we'll make a point down here for our shadows and just decrease. And that's made an S-curve, and now we have a nice S-curve that's relatively even across all of our channels. And we're just going to do the same for the master tonal curve. So we'll make a point in the middle, point over here in the highlights, increase, and then a point in the shadows. And that's it, we've got our S-curve across all of our channels. Now that's not the only thing to do, that's just a common way of adding in a little bit more contrast into our color channels. Of course, if you wanted to, you can add or decrease any of the colors using the tone curve, and you can create some unique things. That's just a quick look at them. You'll notice our other tabs here, they all have a little switch to the left. So if we are focusing on our tone curve and we can click on that switch, what it's going to do is just going to turn that section off so you can see before and after. So this is before any tonal curve adjustments, and this is after. See how that adds a lot of contrast, a lot of pop, a lot of punch into it. Obviously, I don't think that looks amazing. I would need to go in and adjust the basic settings, but for this tutorial, I think it's more important that we look at what each value does rather than trying to make a good photo. So we can turn things on and off using that little switch. Speaking of before and after, if we want to, we can see the entire photo without all of our adjustments. So we can turn all of our adjustments off and on again. And to do that, all we do is we just hit the backslash button. So we can see before our raw original photo and after with our adjustments. So that's just backslash on your keyboard. Just press that one time and it will turn everything off, and you press it again and it's going to turn everything on. So that way you don't have to go in and press the individual on and off buttons for each tab. Moving on to our HSL section. So that's hue, saturation, and luminance. Hue is the individual color range within a certain set of colors. So you've got our color breakdowns here, and then we've got the hue. So where they fall in the middle, that's perfectly neutral, and we can start to shift colors more towards the different colors in which they fall between. So let's explain that. If we look at the green channel, because there's lots of greens in this photo with all the trees, if we were to shift that towards the left, we're going to start to change the individual color of the green channel, and we can also shift it all the way to the right. So you can really start to get some unique color variations. So that is the hues. Saturation is the individual saturation of those color channels. So we can affect how saturated the reds are, the blues, the greens, all of the colors, or we can desaturate them. We can take away all those color channels. So let's have a look. So we've got the greens that we're focused on. If we increase that, we're going to increase the saturation of the greens. We take it away, we're going to decrease the saturation of the greens. What you'll find is some colors are linked to other colors. And what I mean by that is if we go and look at yellow, we can shift the hues of the yellow by sliding all the way to the right or all the way to the left. And yellows are often connected to greens. So if we move the greens, they're going to affect the yellows. If we move the yellows, they're going to affect the greens. So we can make these trees look really nice and orangey, a little bit of orange and teal effect going on if we just drag the yellows down towards the orange side of the slider. Now we can increase or decrease the intensity of those trees, right? So if we can push it all the way up so they're super saturated, super orange, or we can pull it down and we can make something a little bit more stylized where there's hints and flicks of orange coming through in the trees just by dragging down the saturation of the yellow. Same thing for those oranges. So any oranges, so if we look here, we can see the rooftops, they are orange, or we can make those yellow by dragging that slider all the way to the right. Or if we wanted to keep with our orangey theme, we can move it all the way to the left, and that's going to introduce a lot of red. So we want to keep it in the middle at orange. If we look at the red channels under the hue, if we move it all the way to the right and all the way to the left, there's nothing that's happening in that photo because Lightroom has decided that in this photo, there's no red channel because there's nothing red in the image for that slider to affect. So now let's look at the blues and the aquas. So these are another two colors that are going to affect each other ever so slightly. So aquas are going to be the blues, so we can shift those towards more towards a teal, more towards a blue. So we're going to leave aqua alone, and blue is going to also do the exact same thing. It's going to affect the blues as well as the aquas. So think of aqua as a micro adjustment and the blues are the overall adjustment. So what we'll do is we'll just introduce just a little bit of teal into the blues to give it that teal look over in the sea. Now coming down to the saturation and looking at the saturation of the image, we can look at the blues and we can increase and we can add a lot of blue into the ocean, and we can take it away and wash it all away. So we're going to add just a little bit of saturation into the sea there to give a little bit of a pop. And there's no purples or magentas in this image for this saturation to be affected by. Now that was the hue and saturation part of HSL sliders. but the L stands for luminance, and luminance is the individual brightness of those colors. So we can affect the color range in the hues, we can affect the intensity of the color in saturation, and we can affect the brightness of the colors under luminance. So here is where we can really darken or brighten up some of those areas. So if we look at the reds, and we slide that around, there's nothing that's really being affected because there are still no reds in the image. If we look at the oranges, we can increase that. Do you see how it's whitening and lightening up all those rooftops, or we can darken it and add a little bit more contrast in. So for this one, they're a little bit too bright, so we can just decrease the luminance and darken those roofs. So yellows is going to be the trees because it's affecting the greens as well. We can brighten them up or we can darken them down. And same as earlier, guys, we can just double click to reset the individual slider back. So for this, let's just add a little darkness in by dragging the slider down to the right. The greens, again, it's going to affect the trees, the brightness and darkness. So for this one, we'll just increase it a little bit. Aquas, you're going to see that in the ocean, the individual brightness of the aqua channel. So let's just darken it just a tiny bit. Same for blue. Now it's going to have a much more dramatic effect if we go to the maximum ranges of blue. So you can see how that's just affecting the blues in the image. So let's just decrease that a little bit. And then there's no purple or magentas for us to affect the luminance of this image. And when you first open Lightroom, your HSL might look like this. It might be broken down into the individual tabs. So hue, saturation and luminance. If you like it how I like it laid out, where they're all there for you, where you can just go back and tweak without having to go to the individual tabs, you can just click on all and it's going to show you all of them lined up for you. So now we can see what an effect the HSL slider is having, and we can turn that tab off. So if we turn it off, you can see the before and after. So we're just adding a little bit of that orange look into our photo, which we can do in the HSL. So now we look at split toning. If we think of the HSL as moving the original colors of the photograph around, the split toning feature is adding in fake color. So we can add digital color into areas of the photo like the shadows and the highlights. So we can force in extra color if we wanted to. So let's look at the highlights. So again, the highlights are going to be the brightest part of the image. And we've got here a slider which is showing us the hues. So let's say we wanted to add some blue into our sky. We would move our slider over to the blue range, which we can see illustrated by color is right here. So we can just click over the blue and then we can add saturation. So if we increase all the saturation, you see how that's just digitally adding in fake blue up there. So let's say we thought that looked good, just adding a little bit of extra blue in there. And if we wanted to see what it looks like with other colors, well, we can just shift that top slider around. So you can see that's adding in different colors as we change in the hue. So if we leave it over the blue, we'll leave a little bit of blue in it on that sky. And shadows is going to do exactly the same, but for our image, it's the lower portion, the darkest parts of the image. So if we choose our hue that we think we might want to add in, let's just say we want to put in some orange. We'll put our slider over the orange section and we'll just drag up that slider. So you see how it's adding in all this fake orange, which is really cool to be able to add in fake color like that. So here's at 0 and here's with a little bit of orange in the shadow. We'll just leave a couple of pixels of orange in our shadows. Now we can turn that guy off and on, and you can see the effect that the split toning has had. The next section that we'll look at is detail, and this is gonna focus on individual areas of the image. So here we have a little preview of our image if we want to get a closer look at the image. So let's just leave it here so we can see this is all the way over here. So it's going to show us a little close-up in that thumbnail, and we have sharpening, so we can add digital sharpness to our image. So where Lightroom sees individual points, so let's say for example it sees this building here, we've got a change in color pixel density, so that tells Lightroom that that is a part of an image. Now what sharpening does is it adds digital pixels to enhance that image for you, so we can add fake sharpening. So if we just reset that down to 40 or add it, you'll see that all of those pixels, a lot of pixels were digitally added in. And if we just take it off, turn it on, take it off, take it on, and you can see how that's affecting the image. So we can just add a little bit of sharpening if we wanted to. Radius, detail, and masking you don't need to worry about too much, but with masking, you're gonna tell Lightroom where to add those extra pixels for the sharpening. Now to affect that, we can press and hold Alt, and we can drag this slider up, and you see what it's doing. It's going to show you where it's thinking you want to add those sharpening pixels. So say for example, we just want to sharpen the whole image, well, that's where we're going to leave it. We're going to leave it right at 0. And if we increase it, we don't want sharpness in the sky, we don't want sharpness really in the ocean, so we can keep dragging that up, and those areas that were white are going to become black, and it's going to keep highlighted and as an outline where it's going to add those sharpening pixels. So we're going to push it all the way up to 100, and it's only going to sharpen these areas and these areas that were left drawn out by Lightroom, not the ocean or the sky. Now, noise reduction is great. So say, for example, you have a darker image and it's got lots of pixels, it's pixelated, you took it dark, you didn't have enough light. Now you can decrease those noisy parts of the image by dragging up the luminance slider, and that's just going to start to take away all of those noisy areas. And how it's doing that is it's creating almost a mask over those pixels and just kind of like rubbing them out, blurring them out, if you will. The trade-off with that is if you have any sharper parts of the image, maybe it's someone's face at nighttime, their face is going to get a little bit softer. Okay, so let's move down to lens correction. So we have two boxes that we can play with here. We have remove chromatic aberration. Sometimes with the lenses, what will happen is the red, blue, and green channels will do a split. Not noticeable to the naked eye, but if you zoom in, and zoom in into an image, you might notice on sharper areas, edges of walls, a little fringing of those colors, those red, blue, and green. And what this box does, we can remove that from happening. That's what chromatic aberration is. It's the separation of the red, blue, and green channels. Then the second box we have is enable profile corrections. Now, different lenses affect images differently. If we were to shoot on a really wide lens, what that tends to do is cause a slight fisheye effect to the photo. Now, if we click enable profile corrections, it's going to try and flatten it. What it also can do is on certain lenses, especially wide angle lenses, you can get a little bit of vignetting in the top corner. So that's a little bit of darkness in the top corners because it's shot so wide. It gives that little bit of vignetting around. Now, if we enable it, we didn't see anything change for chromatic aberration because remember, it's not really noticeable to the naked eye. But if we do click enable profile corrections and wait for it, it's just going to flatten it. There was a slight fisheye effect to it, and it removed these vignetted parts in the top corner. So let's see before and after. So you see the effect that that's having. And then what it's also going to do, if you use the camera, it's going to also pick out the camera lens that you used. So see here, it's auto filled that for us, right? So Tamron, it's got the lens that I use, the 28-75, and that's just going to be pre-filled. And then we can affect the distortion, so we can increase that fisheye effect or decrease it to make it kind of look as flat as possible, and that vignetting by increasing or decreasing. But it does all of that for us. So that's a really great box just to check off when you start editing. What can happen is you can do your basic settings, you can go through the HSL, you can add tonal curves, and then you can come down here and check enable profile corrections, and it kind of flattens the image for you and removes the vignette, but it also it makes the image maybe a little bit brighter. Now you have to go back up, redo some of the basic selections, pull down the highlights to kind of darken off the image. So whenever you start a photo, just start by checking those two boxes. So moving on, we've got the transform tab, and that means we can just start to manipulate the photo in a slightly weird way. I try and stay away from the transform field, but if we want to look at it, we can click constrain crop, and that's just going to make sure we don't have any white areas like this around our image. We want it to scale, but within the confines of our viewfinder. Let's hit constrain crop, remove our scale feature. Okay, so with constrain crop selected, let's start to manipulate some of these channels. If we want to move it vertically, we can stretch the image up, or negatively, it's just going to stretch and squash that image. Horizontal, it's just going to stretch it the opposite way to vertical. If we need that image straightened, if we wanted to affect the horizon line, which we'll go on to in just a moment, we can do that here and rotate. That's definitely not the best way of doing it. We have aspect, which is going to squash and stretch it out again, just in a different way to give a different look to our image. Scale, it's going to scale up or scale down the image. We can move it left or move it right. So these aren't commonly used, but here, if we wanted to manipulate those values of a photo, we can do that in Transform. So we can move down to the Effects tab, and we only have a few options here. The first one that we have, all the others are grayed out, but as soon as we start to affect this first one, it's going to allow us to change the settings here. So this is a vignette. So similar to the tab before, how we checked the box and it removed the vignette. If we want to add in a vignette, if we want to add a dark vignette or a bright vignette, this is how we would do it. We would drag it down for a darker vignette, or we would drag it up for a brighter vignette. So if we drag it down, and it's just going to darken those corners. Imagine an iris coming over the top of that photo, and it's going to darken that. So if we just, for this one, I like to have a little bit of vignetting on my photos. We can leave it around there. Now, if we want to see what the other side is doing, we can drag it all the way down, and we can change the midpoint. So that's just going to affect the middle point of our vignette. The roundness is going to be how round the vignette is. So we can have it in the middle, which is more of an iris, or we can drag it to the left and it's going to be more of a square, or we can drag it all the way to the right and it's going to be more of a round circle. So if you have a photo that's in a different aspect ratio, not a 1920 format, we can affect the roundness. Now the feather is going to be how harsh that vignette is. So here is a little bit of feathering before the black affects the image. We can increase that feather or we can decrease it to give it a hard line. So for this one, we'll just add a tiny bit of vignetting. Grain is going to digitally add grain, so kind of like a noise, some extra pixels to make it look more of like a film look, less of a digital look. So if we add grain and we zoom in, you can see all of these extra pixels that are coming from the grain. So people like to make their photos look a little bit less digital, a little bit more like a film camera. You would do that in the grain channel. So no grain and grain. You can see that grain getting added in. We can affect the size of the grain with this slider, and the roughness, so how much grain is going to appear or how little grain is going to appear. So we can just reset that one. Now the last tab that we have to look at is the calibration, and that's going to be a digital changing of these red, green and blue channels. So if we look at, we first focus on the reds. So similar to how we had in the HSL, we could affect the hues and the saturations of a color channel. We can do something similar, but more extreme in the camera calibration settings. So if we choose red, we drag it, it's going to affect all of those reds. So it's going to make them more orange or more red. So you see how that's having a dramatic effect, or we can do the saturation, increase or decrease the saturation past the point of what we've already done in the HSL. So say we want a color channel to be more saturated, more pushed to one side of the hue, or we can do that in the camera calibration settings. Same for greens, and then we can affect saturation. You see how that's also having an effect on the blues and even the reds. So these ones start to affect all of the others. They don't just singularly affect that one color channel. So we can increase or decrease the saturation of the greens. Let's reset that back down to 0. And then lastly, those blues again. So you see if we increase or decrease the blues, we're not just changing the look of the blues, we're also changing the look of those oranges. So these three are all connected. So you can kind of counteract these ones. So if we were to say, pull this one down to -50, we were to increase this one to +50. Now that doesn't look so different as from the original because we're balancing out those scales. So if here's 0, we're moving them at the same pace. And that's just going to keep the color ranges at more of an equal level, just increase or decrease their saturation. So we can turn it off and turn it on. So it's just adding saturation into those color channels without dramatically affecting one color channel that's not affecting the other. So now that we've made our way through the tabs, we can see 2 buttons here. We've got previous and reset. So we just want to totally reset our image. We don't like it when we start from scratch. We can do that right here by hitting reset, and it's going to reset the entire image back to what it was before we started working on it. So now let's have a look at some of these areas that we have to play with here. This is going to be our crop, where we can change the crop of the image and have a focus point of the image. Now because this is a raw photo and it contains a lot of information, we can crop right in on something and it's not going to look all pixelated when we export it. Here we have aspect, so we can choose a certain crop that's going to be predefined for us. 1 by 1 is going to be a square and so on. So say we wanted to do an Instagram format, the tall Instagram format, we're going to choose 8 by 10. And this is doing it on a wide scale for us, and if we want it on portrait, we can just click the crop and move it until it snaps to the tall. And now this is going to be the perfect Instagram size. So if we move our focus point more towards the middle, over here we're going to get a live update window for us, and then we can just hit done, and then that's going to crop the photo for us, which is again that perfect Instagram size. If we go back in here, there's a few other tools that we can play with. We can change the angle, which is just going to rotate. So say this photo wasn't taken perfectly on a tripod, or you were leaning one way or leaning the other way, or you just didn't get the horizon line perfect, you can change the angle to line it up for you. Or you can do something else. You can click this icon and your mouse is going to change to like a digital spirit level, and we can draw over by clicking and holding. We can draw over that horizon line. So we can see the horizon line goes like this. If we let go, it's going to rotate that image for us to make it straight. We always want our images to be straight in terms of where the horizon line falls on the image. And this is a great little tool, so you don't have to eyeball it. You can click drag and hold and draw a line over that horizon line, and it's gonna rotate your image for you. So now we can hit done. So the next thing that we're gonna look at, guys, is the filters. So we have a linear filter and a radial filter. So we're gonna get some new options in a drop-down box here. Now, linear filters are ways to draw over a certain section of an image and adjust that, kind of like drawing a curtain over something, and then everything that's under the curtain is gonna be affected. So let's have a look at that. If we click and hold and drag and pull down, we're gonna get these lines that pop up. And when we drag down, this part at the top is going to be what's affected, and then the second part of these lines are going to be the feather to 0. So where that middle, this little middle circle icon is, that's going to be up to 100, and then from the middle circle down, that's going to be everything that's going to be feathered down. So let's say we just want to draw over the sky. We can do this, we can let go. Now we've got all of these settings that we're used to now from the basics tab when we started editing the photo, and we can adjust even more. So we can drag down highlights, which is starting to affect up here. If we were to pull down exposure, you see how it's affecting the top, and then from here downwards, it's feathering down to 0. Or we can change the temperature. We can increase oranges, increase blues. Same thing for tint. We can add tinting into that section. All the other sliders from our basic sliders from when we first started editing the photo, they're all available here, which is just going to affect this top part. So let's see what that looks like from the bottom. So we click, hold, and we drag up and we draw that filter. And remember, everything from where you started, so back here to the middle section, is going to be 100% of what we're changing on our sliders, and everything from the circle to the second line is going to be feathered down to 0. So let's have a look at that. If we wanted this bottom half to be dark, we can drag this exposure slider down and everything's going to be dark. If we wanted to brighten it up, we can brighten it up. See, here is 100, and then it's feathering away to 0. If we want to increase the feather, we can drag that up, or if we want to decrease the area in which it's affecting, we can click and hold and decrease. We just want the house to be slightly illuminated, or we want this house to be slightly darker. This is going to be basically 100, and from here to here, these 2 points are going to be feathered to 0. We can also remove any, and you can also have multiple at the same time. So if we wanted one there, we also wanted one to come down from the top, we also wanted one to come in from the side, we can have multiple, and then they're going to be selectable by these little gray icons when you have this selected. When you're finished with it, you can hit done, and then those new options, they fade away. And if we want to bring them back, all we have to do is select the linear filter option again, and we're going to see the points in which we have linear filters. If we want to remove one or edit one, we can just select it, and it gives us our options to change. Or we can just hit delete, and we can remove those individual linear filters. Okay, so we can move on to radial filters. So radial filters are very similar to linear filters in terms of all the settings, but what we're going to get is a circle rather than a line dragging in from an area. So we can just draw a circle over here, for example, and we can move it around by clicking and dragging on the little circle in the middle. We can move that around, and then we can start to play with the sliders over here on the right. Now it's going to start by affecting everything outside of the circle. We want to affect everything inside the circle. So what we have to do is you have to come down here, hit invert, and now all of the changes that we make over here in our sliders are going to be affected by what's inside of our circle, which we can increase its size by clicking and dragging on these little areas over on the side. We can click the middle to move him around, and we can affect all of these settings from our basic slider from the beginning of this video right here individually in our radial filters. And we can make as many of these radial filters as we like. We can draw, we can move, and then we can add contrast, decrease contrast. And each time we draw a radial filter, we're going to have to invert it if we want everything on the inside of that circle to be affected. Now we have another option, which is called feather. So let's increase the brightness right inside of this new circle. Now, feather we looked at earlier, but that's basically going to be how much feathering between the line and the middle point of our circle that we've drawn. Naturally, it puts the feather at 50%, which is a good middle ground, so it's going to feather the edges, so it's not a hard edge. If we pull that all the way down, it's going to draw us a perfect hard line around the circle, so that's 0 feather. If we want it in the middle, that's 50, that's even. If we want even more feathering, we can drag that up, and it's going to feather even more away from that edge. If we want to delete any of our radial filters, we just make sure they're selected. You can see them again by these little gray dots. So you can select them to change each filter, and you can just delete them. So select and delete. So if you make a bunch, you don't like how they're looking, you can just select these little grey dots, hit delete, and then they'll be gone forever. And then you can hit done, and then you're taken back to your main editing menu. Now the last one that we're going to look at here is a wand looking matchstick type of an icon. If we select it, our new drop down menu comes, and what we are left with is a new icon. And this is basically a paintbrush tool. So with linear filters, we can select over larger areas like skies, we can drag over, or individual areas, we can drag a box almost over the top. Radial filters, we can add circles and we can manipulate and squash and stretch those circles to fit over individual areas. But if we want finer control, more minute detail, we can use a paintbrush to paint over individual areas. If we wanted to say change the appearance of this building over here in the distance and we couldn't quite finagle a radial filter over the top, we can use a paintbrush to individually select and paint over that building, and then we have individual controls from our basic settings. So if we wanted to do that, we would start by maybe zooming in. So to zoom in, it's Command plus and Command minus to zoom back out again. So let's zoom into that building with Command plus. Now it's just going to move into the middle of the screen, and we want to be able to move our way around the artboard now that we've zoomed in. So to do that, we can press and hold the spacebar, brings up a hand icon. While holding spacebar, click and hold and move around the image. So now we're over the building. Now what we're going to want to do is paint over that building. So we start by painting, and we're going to select that building. Now you can see I'm clicking and holding and painting. We can't see anything. Now to see where we've painted, we have to select this option here. And that just makes it all red. So it shows us where we've been painting. If, for example, we had no idea, I could have clicked over here, come around here, accidentally selected a bunch of different things, and we would never know. But with this show selected mask overlay, we can see exactly where I've painted. So we'll just undo that. We've got our building selected, and we're now going to increase the exposure. We want it to be nice and bright. So we're going to drag the exposure up. Now we can't see anything because we've still got this box selected. So select this box when you're painting. When you're finished painting, uncheck the box, and then you'll be able to see what settings you're changing over on the side. So if we uncheck that, we can see how this has been affected by the exposure. We can darken it, lighten it, add contrast into it, texture, sharpness. All of the individual basic settings are again available for us right here when we're painting over individual elements. So let's zoom back out so we can see how useful being able to paint individual elements of a photograph would be. But what if we wanted to paint a whole sky or a whole ocean? So before we would paint, we have to check our little box so we can see where we're painting. Now, if we paint like this and we want to do the whole sky, it's going to take a long time. So we can actually increase the size of the paintbrush. So to increase, we're going to use the square brackets. The left square bracket is going to decrease the size of the brush, and right square bracket is going to increase the size of the brush. So if we hit right square bracket and just keep hitting it, the paintbrush is just going to get bigger and bigger. Now when we click and paint, it's going to take us way less time to cover the whole area. And then when we want to do those fine details, we can use left bracket to decrease the size of the brush. Keep pressing it. Now we're going to get a smaller brush and we can draw over those finer detailed areas of the photograph, just like that. Now let's say, for example, we accidentally painted over the landscape or whichever part that you're painting, and you don't want to start again, you don't want to delete the whole thing and repaint the whole thing. You can remove parts that you've painted. To do that, you can press and hold Alt. And with Alt selected, you can increase or decrease the size of the brush again. So with Alt selected, that means negative. Your paintbrush is going to change and it's going to look with a minus. That means you're removing where you've painted. So with Alt selected, you can increase or decrease the size of the paintbrush. So if we want to remove all of this area, we can have the Alt selected. So remove and increase the size of the brush. And when we click and paint, it's just going to remove all of that area. We can reduce the size of the paintbrush and remove all of this stuff that we did by accident. And that's how we would paint individual areas of a photograph to manipulate them without having to do a circle or a linear type of filter. We can paint over individual assets and have access to all of these controls right there, which makes it super, super, super useful. Now we can just delete this section, click it, hit delete, come down here and hit done. Now we can have a final look at our photograph before and after using backslash. So if we hit that before and after, you can really see the dramatic effect that we can have by editing photos in Lightroom. Okay, so let's say we're finished with the photograph, we've edited all the areas, we've covered all of the sections that we're going through. Now you're ready to export the photo. So what we can do, we can come up to File and Export. And we're going to get a couple of options that we need to go through. So we can choose where we want to save our file to. So we're just going to put it in that folder right there. We can put it in subfolders. We can rename the file. We're just going to leave all of that blank and we're going to scroll down to file settings. We want to export it as a JPEG. You can choose these additional options if you want to. We can change the quality. We're going to leave it at 100% because we want the maximum amount of quality in that photo. We can check this box if we want to limit the file size. So we don't want it to be bigger than 5 megabytes. Well, we can choose that. We can resize the image to fit whichever dimensions that we want. So we don't want it to be wider than 1920 or 1000. We can do that right here, but we're going to leave it alone because we've already cropped it to the aspect ratio that we want. Doesn't matter for the purpose for this photo if it's any bigger, but say you have a website, a banner, an email, you need it to be no wider than a certain size, well then you can do that right here in the width and the height. We can leave resolution at 240 alone, which is the pixels per inch. So I always leave my photos at 240 pixels per inch. We can come down here and we want to check this box, sharpen for. We want to choose screen and mount standard. So what that's going to do is it's going to sharpen ever so slightly, ever so subtly more so than the sharpening slider that we went over. It's going to sharpen it for screens. So for this image, we cropped it to the 8:10 aspect ratio for Instagram. When you post a photo or a video on Instagram, it has to go through a compression engine before it gets uploaded. By doing this, this just adds a little bit of extra detail, a little extra sharpening into the photo so that we can bring back some of that sharpness that the compression of social media takes away from it. Lastly, we can affect any metadata, we can add a watermark, and then we can choose what we want to happen after we've exported the photo. So for me, I have show in Finder, and then we can just hit export. Lightroom's going to export the photo for us, and then it's going to open the photo and we can preview our photo, and now we have our photo exported out of Lightroom, ready for use, ready for posting, ready to do whatever you like with it. That is it, guys. That is our Lightroom beginners in the 2020 version of Lightroom Classic. I hope you found it useful. I hope you learned something. So this was just a basic overview of Lightroom 2020 with all of its new features and going down all of those individual sliders and settings. I have a few more videos on Lightroom here on YouTube, guys. I will link them in the description box for you and in cards in the top corner so you can access them at relevant points if you want to continue learning Lightroom with me. If you did like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more tutorial based things on content creation and editing, and I will see you in the next video.